of an actual entity is intolerant of any addition, expresses the fact that every actual entity, since it is what it is finally its own reason for what it omits. In the real internal constitution of an actual entity there is always some element which is contrary to an omitted element. Here, contrary means the impossibility of joint entry in the same sense. In other words, indetermination has evaporated from satisfaction, so that there is a complete determination of feeling, or of negation of feeling, respecting the universe. This evaporation of indetermination is merely another way of considering the process, whereby the actual entity arises from its data. Thus, in another sense, each actual entity includes the uni 72 verse, by reason of its determinate attitude towards every element in the universe. Thus the process of becoming is dipolar, I by reason of its qualification by the determinateness of the actual world, and E by its conceptual prehensions of the indeterminateness of eternal objects. The process is constituted by the influx of eternal objects into a novel determinateness of feeling which absorbs the actual world into a novel actuality. The formal constitution of an actual entity is a process of transition from indetermination towards terminal determination. But the indetermination is referent to determinate data. The objective constitution of an actual entity is its terminal determination, considered as a complex of component determinates by reason of which the actual entity is a datum for. The creative advance. L11E actual entity on its physical side is composed of its determinate feelings of its actual world, and on its mental side is originated by its conceptual appetitions. Returning to the correlation of givenness and potentiality, we see that givenness refers to potentiality, and potentiality to givenness. Also we see that the completion of givenness in actual fact converts the not given for that fact into impossibility for that fact. The individuality of an actual entity involves an exclusive limitation. This element of exclusive limitation is the definiteness essential for the synthetic unity of an actual entity. This synthetic unity forbids the notion of mere addition to the included elements. It is evident that givenness and potentiality are both meaningless apart from a multiplicity of potential entities. These potentialities are the eternal objects. Apart from potentiality and givenness, there can be no 46. Discussions and applications. Nexus of actual things in process of supersession by novel actual things. The alternative is a static monistic universe, without unrealized potentialities, since less than potentiality is then a meaningless term. 73. The scope of the ontological principle is not exhausted by the corollary that less than decision must be referable to an actual entity. Everything must be somewhere, and here less than somewhere means less than some actual entity. Namely the general potentiality of the universe must be somewhere, since it retains its proximate relevance to actual entities for which it is unrealized. This less than proximate relevance reappears in subsequent concrescence as final causation regulative of the emergence of novelty. This less than somewhere is the non-temporal actual entity. Thus less than proximate relevance means relevance is in the primordial mind of God. It is a contradiction in terms to assume that some explanatory fact can float into the actual world out of nonentity. Nonentity is nothingness. Every explanatory fact refers to the decision and to the efficacity of an actual thing. The notion of less than subsistence is merely the notion of how eternal objects can be components of the primordial nature of God. This is a question for subsequent discussion p. Part 5. But eternal objects, as in God's primordial nature, constitute the Platonic world of ideas. There is not, however, one entity which is merely the class of all eternal objects. For if we conceive any class of eternal objects, there are additional eternal objects which presuppose that class but do not belong to it. For this reason, at the beginning of this section, the phrase less than the multiplicity of Platonic forms was used, instead of the more natural phrase less than that class of Platonic forms. A multiplicity is a type of complex thing which has the unity derivative from some qualification which participates in each of its components severally, but a multiplicity has no unity derivative merely from its various components. Section IV. The doctrine just stated that every explanatory fact refers to the deci-tilde-scion and to the efficacy of an actual 7-4 thing requires discussion in ref-tilde-arens to the ninth categorial obligation. This category states that L. the concrescence of each individual actual entity is internally determined and is externally free. The peculiarity of the course of history illustrates the joint relevance of the less than ontological principle, and of this categorial obligation. The evolution of history can be rationalized by the consideration of the determination of successors by antecedents. But, on the other hand, the evolution of his tilde-tory is incapable of rationalization because it exhibits a selected flux of participating forms. No reason, internal to history, can be assigned why that flux of forms, rather than another flux, should have been illustrated. It is true that any flux must exhibit the character of internal determina tilde-tion. So much follows from the ontological principle. But every instance of fact and form 47 internal determination assumes that flux up to that point. There is no reason why there could be no alternative flux exhibiting that principle of internal determination. The actual flux presents itself with the character of being merely less than given. It does not disclose any peculiar character of less than perfection. On the contrary, the imperfection of the world is the theme of every religion which offers a way of escape, and of every skeptic who deplores the prevailing superstition. The Leibnizian theory of the less than best of possible worlds is an audacious fudge produced in order to save the face of a creator constructed by contemporary and antecedent theologians. Further, in the case of those actualities whose immediate experience is most completely open to us, namely, human beings, the final decision of the immediate subject superject, constituting the ultimate modification of subjective aim, is the foundation of our experience of responsibility, of approbation or of disapprobation, of self-approval or of self-reproach, of freedom, of emphasis. This element in experience is too large to be put aside merely as misconstruction. It governs the whole tone of human life. It can be illustrated by striking 75 instances from fact or from fiction. But these instances are only conspicuous illustrations of human experience during each hour and each minute. The ultimate freedom of things, lying beyond all determinations, was whispered by Galileo e Circe muo, freedom for the inquisitors to think wrongly, for Galileo to think rightly, and for the world to move in despite of Galileo and inquisitors. The doctrine of the philosophy of organism is that, however far the sphere of efficient causation be pushed in the determination of components of a concrescence, its data, its emotions, its appreciations, its purposes, its phases of subjective aim beyond the determination of these components, there always remains the final reaction of the self-creative unity of the universe. This final reaction completes the self-creative act by putting TBE decisive stamp of creative emphasis upon the determinations of efficient cause. Each occasion exhibits its measure of creative emphasis in proportion to its measure of subjective intensity. The absolute standard of such intensity is that of the primordial nature of God, which is neither great nor small because it arises out of no actual world. It has within it no components which are standards of comparison. But in the temporal world, for occasions of relatively slight experient intensity, their decisions of creative emphasis are individually negligible compared to the determined components which they receive and transmit. But a final accumulation of all such decisions, the decision of God's nature and the decisions of all occasions, constitutes that special element in the flux of forms in history, which is less than given, and incapable of rationalization beyond the fact that within it every component which is determinable is internally determined. The doctrine is, that each concrescence is to be referred to a definite pre-initiation and a definite pre-conclusion. The initial fact is macrocosmic, in the sense of having equal relevance to all occasions. The final fact is micro. 48. Discussions and applications. 76. Cosmic, in the sense of being peculiar to that occasion. Neither fact is capable of rationalization, in the sense of tracing the antecedents which determine it. The initial fact is the primordial appetition, and the final fact is the decision of emphasis, finally creative of the less than satisfaction. Section B. The antithetical terms less than universals and less than particulars are the usual words employed to denote respectively entities which nearly, though not quite, 9 correspond to the entities here termed eternal objects and actual entities. These terms, less than universals and less than particulars, both in the suggestiveness of the two words and in their current philosophical use, are somewhat misleading. The ontological principle, and the wider doctrine of universal relativity, on which the present metaphysical discussion is founded, blur the sharp distinction between what is universal and what is particular. The notion of a universal is of that which can enter into the description of many particulars, whereas the notion of a particular is that it is described by universals, and does not itself enter into the description of any other particular. According to the doctrine of relativity, which is the basis of the metaphysical system of the present lectures, both these notions involve a misconception. An actual entity cannot be described, even inadequately, by universals, because other actual entities do enter into the description of any one actual entity. Thus every so-called less than universal is particular in the sense of being just what it is, diverse from everything else, and every so-called less than particular, is universal in the sense of entering into the constitutions of other actual entities. The contrary opinion led to the collapse of Descartes, many substances into Spinoza's one substance, to Leibniz's windowless monads with their pre-established harmony, to the skeptical reduction of Hume's philosophy, a reduction first effected by Hume himself, 77, and reissued with the most beautiful exposition by Santayana in his Skepticism and Animal Faith. The point is that the current view of universals and particulars inevitably leads to the epistemological position stated by Descartes. From this I should conclude that I knew the wax by means of vision and not simply by the intuition of the mind, unless by chance I remember that, when looking from a window and saying I see men who pass in the street, I really do not see them, but infer that what I see is men, just as I say that I see wax. And yet what do I see from the window but hats and coats which may cover automatic machines? Yet I judge these to be men. And similarly solely by the faculty of judgment I candy, which rests in my mind, I comprehend that which I believed I saw with my eyes. 10. 9. For example, prehensions and subjective forms are also less than particulars. 10. Meditation 2. Fact and form. 49. In this passage it is assumed 11 that Descartes' ego in question is a particular, characterized only by universals. Thus his impressions, to use Hume's word, are characterizations by universals. Thus there is no perception of a particular actual entity. He arrives at the belief in the actual entity by less than the faculty of judgment. But on this theory he has absolutely no analogy upon which to found any such inference with the faintest shred of probability. Hume, accepting Descartes' account of perception in this passage, which also belongs to Locke in some sections of his essay, easily draws the skeptical conclusion. Santayana irrefutably exposes the full extent to which this skepticism must be carried. The philosophy of organism recurs to Descartes' alternative theory of relativo activa, and endeavors to interpret it in terms of a consistent ontology. Descartes endeavored to combine the two theories, but his unquestioned acceptance of the subject-predicate dogma forced him, 78, into a representative theory of perception, involving a less than, udicium, validated by our assurance of the power and the goodness of God. The philosophy of organism in its account of prehension takes its stand upon the Cartesian terms, relativo, activa, inspectio, and less than intuitio. The two latter terms are transformed into the notion of a less than positive prehension, and into operations described in the various categories of physical and conceptual origination. A recurrence to the notion of less than God is still necessary to mediate between physical and conceptual prehensions, but not in the crude form of giving a limited letter of credit to a udicium. Hume, in effect, agrees that less than mind is a process of concrescence arising from primary data. In his account, these data are less than impressions of sensation, and in such impressions no elements other than universals are discoverable. For the philosophy of organism, the primary data are always actual entities absorbed into feeling in virtue of certain universals shared alike by the objectified actuality and the experienced subject P. Part 3. Descartes takes an intermediate position. He explains perception in Humean terms, but adds an apprehension of particular actual entities in virtue of an less than inspectio, and a less than indicium, effected by the mind. Meditations 2 and 3t. Here he is paving the way for Kant, and for the degradation of the world into mere appearance. All modern philosophy hinges round the difficulty of describing the world in terms of subject and predicate, substance and quality, particular and universal. The result always does violence to that immediate experience which we express in our actions, our hopes, our sympathies, our purposes, and which we enjoy in spite of our lack of phrases for its verbal. 11. Perhaps inconsistently with what Descartes says elsewhere, in other passages, the mental activity involved seems to be analysis which discovers less than real as O's. Iactiva, as a component element of the idea in question, whereas thus, inspectio, rather than eudicium. 50. Discussions and applications. Analysis. We find ourselves in a buzzing 12-wad, amid a democracy of fellow creatures, whereas, under some disguise or other, orthodox philosophy can only introduce us to solitary substances, each enjoying an illusory experience. Nuo Vadam, Route 79. Art change. What do I see on thee? The endeavor to interpret experience in accordance with the overpowering deliverance of common sense that must bring us back to some restatement of Platonic realism, modified so as to avoid the pitfalls which the philosophical investigations of the 17th and 18th centuries have disclosed. The true point of divergence is the false notion suggested by the contrast between the natural meanings of the words less than particular, and less than universal. The less than particular is thus conceived as being just its individual self with no necessary relevance to any other particular. It answers to Descartes' definition of substance. When we conceive of substance, we merely conceive an existent thing which requires nothing but itself in order to exist. 13. This definition is a true derivative from Aristotle's definition. A primary substance is neither asserted of a subject nor present in a subject. 14. We must add the title phrase of Descartes, the second meditation, of the nature of the human mind, and that it is more easily known than the body, together with his two statements. Thought constitutes the nature of thinking substance, and everything that we find in mind is but so many diverse forms of thinking. 15. This sequence of quotations exemplifies the set of presuppositions which led to Locke's empiricism and to Kant's critical philosophy, the two dominant influences from which modern thought is derived. This is the side of 17th century philosophy which is here discarded. The principle of universal relativity directly traverses Aristotle's dictum, less than a substance it is not present in a subject. On the contrary, according to this principle an actual entity is present in other actual entities. In fact, if we allow for degrees of relevance, and for negligible relevance, we must say that every actual entity is present in every other actual entity. The philosophy of organism 80 is mainly devoted to the task of making clear the notion of less than being present in another entity. This phrase is here borrowed from Aristotle. It is not a fortunate phrase, and in subsequent discussion it will be replaced by the term less than objectification. The Aristotelian phrase suggests the crude notion that one actual entity is added to another simplicitor. This is not what is meant. One role of the eternal objects is that they are those elements which express how any one actual entity is constituted by its synthesis of other actual entities, and how that actual entity develops from the primary dative phase into its own individual actual. 12. This epithet is, of course, borrowed from William James. 13 Principles of Philosophy, Part 1, 51. 14 Aristotle by W. D. Ross, Ch. 2. 15 Principles of Philosophy, Part 1, 53. Fact and Form, 51. Existence, involving its individual enjoyments and appetitions. An actual entity is concrete because it is such a particular concrescence of the universe. Section B. A short examination of Locke's essay concerning human understanding will throw light on the presuppositions from which the philosophy of organism originates. These citations from Locke are valuable as clear statements of the obvious deliverances of common sense, expressed with their natural limitations. They cannot be bettered in their character of presentations of facts which have to be accepted by any satisfactory system of philosophy. The first point to notice is that in some of his statements Locke comes very near to the explicit formulation of an organic philosophy of the type being developed here. It was only his failure to notice that his problem required a more drastic revision of traditional categories than that which he actually effected, that led to a vagueness of statement, and the intrusion of inconsistent elements. It was this conservative, other side of Locke which led to his skeptical overthrow by Hume. In his turn, Hume, despite his explicit repudiation in his treatise, Part 1, Sect. He was a thorough conservative, and in his explanation of mentality and its content never moved away from the subject-predicate habits of thought 81, which had been impressed on the European mind by the overemphasis on Aristotle's logic during the long mediaeval period. In reference to this twist of mind, probably Aristotle was not an Aristotelian. But Hume's skeptical reduction of knowledge entirely depends, for its arguments, on the tacit presupposition of the mind as subject and of its contents as predicates of presupposition which explicitly he repudiates. The merit of Locke's essay concerning human understanding is its adequacy, and not its consistency. He gives the most dispassionate descriptions of those various elements in experience which common sense never lets slip. Unfortunately, he is hampered by inappropriate metaphysical categories which he never criticized. He should have widened the title of his book into less than an essay concerning experience. His true topic is the analysis of the types of experience enjoyed by an actual entity. But this complete experience is nothing other than what the actual entity is in itself, for itself. I will adopt the pre-Kantian phraseology, and say that the experience enjoyed by an actual entity is that entity formulator. By this I mean that the entity, when considered less than formally, is being described in respect to those forms of its constitution whereby it is that individual entity with its own measure of absolute self-realization. Its less than ideas of things or what other things are for it. In the phraseology of these lectures, they are its less than feelings. The actual entity is composite and analyzable, and its less than ideas express how, and in what sense, other things are components in its own. 52. Discussions and applications. Constitution. Thus the form of its constitution is to be found by an analysis of the Lockean ideas. Locke talks